So the M1 iPad Pro has been out for a little over 18 months now, and normally around this time of year, in October, Apple gets ready and gets us ramped up for a new version of the iPad Pro, whether that's an M2 iPad Pro, or an M1 Pro, or M1 Max iPad Pro. We're still yet to see exactly what's going to happen to the iPad Pro, but we did see on Twitter a graphic designer by the name of Parker Ortolani actually put together some images and some mock-up of what it would look like if the M2 iPad Pro actually adopted that new dynamic island that we saw with the iPhone 14 Pro and 14 Pro Max, because a lot of people either love it or they hate it. But I think the dynamic island actually belongs on the iPad versus the iPhone. But let's talk about it. So right now, the dynamic island on the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max is actually more of a notification kind of icon situation, but then also sort of a task switcher or a multitasking switcher for your most recent 2 or up to 3 applications. And for the most part, it is more of a form over function situation, but it does prove out a couple concepts which would go extremely well with an 11, a 12.9, and maybe even a 14.1 inch iPad Pro, which hopefully we see at the end of this year. So the first thing that it does prove out is if you line up the dynamic island up against the bezel of the iPad Pro, Apple has no excuse anymore when it comes to people wanting the main camera or the selfie camera to move into that landscape orientation. Apple, since the beginning of the iPad and since the beginning of the iPhones, has had that selfie camera in the actual portrait orientation, but most people, especially in the iPad Pro category, use their iPad Pro as a laptop supplement. So they use it in landscape mode, on their Magic Keyboard, and they use it to take video conference calls. And the biggest detriment of having the iPad Pro front-facing camera in portrait mode is that now every single time you have a Zoom call or a Google Meet or whatever video call software you use, you're always looking off to the left. So it doesn't look like you're actually looking at the person that's on the screen with you. So moving that over into a dynamic island and putting that into a landscape orientation while still keeping the magnets and the chargers to magnetically attach and charge that Apple Pencil 2 is now a given. Like, there's no excuse, because that camera, if they can fit it into this little pill and hole punch cutout on the iPhone 14, you can definitely fit it in the bezels or right underneath the bezels of any iPad moving forward. But one thing that was written out, which I'll read out loud to you guys right now, is what Apple actually wants a dynamic island to be. So the dynamic island enables new ways to interact with the iPhone, featuring a design that blends the line between hardware and software, adapting in real time to show important alerts, notifications, and activities. With the introduction of the dynamic island, the True Depth camera has been redesigned to take up less of the display area without impeding content on the screen, and the dynamic island maintains its active state to allow users easier access to controls with a simple tap and hold. So I think this fits perfectly in that argument that now we can actually have that camera in landscape orientation and also include the Face ID sensors and maybe slim the bezels on the actual iPad Pro itself and put that a little bit underneath the bezel so it all fits perfectly. But then what Parker outlines in the rest of this article is actually a very well thought out and way of using that dynamic island. So what Parker actually listed out is actually using this as a strength, which is what Apple does extremely well. So they turn the dynamic island, which should have been a weakness or something that gets in the way, into a strength of the future iPhone and the iPhone 14. So they can do the same thing with the iPad Pro, bringing that UI into the iPad Pro and then using multiple quote-unquote islands to display different UI features of certain applications. So for instance, instead of having that whole file menu where it's file, edit, view, and those other regular toolbar menu options, turn those into islands for any application that you're using, and Apple could very easily adopt that while still keeping that same camera sensor in that middle island spot. So I thought this was a great implementation where it says, Parker Ortolani took this concept to imagine where instead of just making the dynamic island larger, the designer imagined several little islands across the iPad called island menus. He explains that you can hover your cursor over the dynamic islands to access powerful features of your favorite iPad apps. So again, it would mesh perfectly well. Obviously, there would have to be some UI implementations, third-party applications, and third-party developers will have to have an SDK kit for this dynamic island or the multiple islands. But again, I think it would be a great implementation to see that in landscape mode on top of an iPad Pro. And it could be used almost as tabs in Safari, but as a multitasking switcher, and you can decide to wave it off or bring it back down, almost like an inverted dock. So you know when you have an iPad Pro and you want to access your dock when you're already inside of an app, you just kind of swipe up to bring up your dock, but you can also maybe swipe down to bring up all the different multitasking applications that are running in the background and choose between them. I think that would be a great implementation. So I think the implementation of the dynamic island is a great, next step for the iPad Pro, because as you guys seen, Apple really leans into these design choices. So first, it was with the notch. They actually made the outline of all of their iPhones, have a notch on their website when selecting that, so people know if you have a notch, you have an iPhone. Same thing is probably going to happen with this dynamic island on the iPhones and then probably into the iPad Pro. And Apple normally puts the latest and greatest into the iPad Pro and then trickles it down to the rest of the iPad lineup. So I think that's what's going to happen next. And the next thing I want to mention is with the iPad Pro and when it should be releasing or if there's going to be an event. Like I mentioned earlier, normally there's an event in October that's very iPad focused. That's when we got the original 2018 iPad Pro, and Apple usually goes in 18-month cycles when it comes to the iPad Pro. So this M1 iPad Pro actually released in March of 2021, which puts us at around that 18-month mark of a new M2 iPad Pro possibly releasing. But as of right now, there's no invite for an October event going on to anybody, and normally around October 7th is the date that it happens. But let's see what Apple does. They could also do a soft release like they did with the AirPods Pro, the original ones, back in 2019, where they just released it with a press release, because they figured they don't really need to do an entire press event to release some AirPods Pro. Maybe they think they don't need an entire press event for an M2 iPad Pro because it's going to be iterative versus a real game changer. But I don't know, if it has Dynamic Island, they should really tout it with a keynote. But let's see what Apple does. But I just wanted to bring you guys this video. Let me know what you guys think. If you think, if you like the Dynamic Island on the current iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max, because I'm a little bit in between. I think it's a very cool feature. It doesn't add much functionality, but I think it would add way more functionality on an iPad Pro with iPad multitasking. But that's going to do it for this video. If you guys did make it to the end, leave a little dolphin in the comments down below so I know you made it to the end. And let me know in the comments down below, would you embrace a dynamic island on an iPad if it meant that you get to go into landscape mode when video chatting, which is something that should be coming to the next M2 iPad Pro no matter what the case may be, no matter how the implementation is. Always curious to know what you guys think. But that's going to do it for this video. If you guys want to watch more iOS, iPadOS, and just more Apple content in general, click on one of these videos right here. And we do have a good video coming soon depending on when this one's releasing. So definitely stay subscribed. But that's going to do it. I'm Fernando. I'm out of here. Peace.